I'm going to talk about a couple of things. So basically, I want to chat a little bit about what's happening with offshore wells, particular wells that are in the federal outer continental shelf. Um, it's a sort of different problem than what we're seeing with a lot of the onshore orphan wells and abandoned wells and marginal producing wells that I think will take up the majority of the conversation today. But just want to highlight a couple of regulatory and risk related issues around some of these offshore wells and some interesting case studies from the last couple of years that may give us a little bit of a glimpse into what may be coming in the decades ahead. And then, like Daniel noted, I want to talk a little bit about the IOGCC, citing from Natalie's presentation. They play a really significant role kind of anytime the federal government is doing policy making and executing policy in collaboration with regulators, oil and gas regulators across a number of states. So I want to just shine a little bit of light on some of the research we've done there about some of their political allegiances and the role that they've particularly played with the Infrastructure and Jobs Act when it comes to how federal money may be, doled out to plug wells. So Taking ahead to the next slide here. Let's see. So yeah, two kind of main things just to frame things up in terms of what makes these offshore wells interesting. Again, talking about federal offshore wells here, there are a number of wells, of course, that are in state waters. So in a place like Texas, you have a number of bay wells and Gulf of Mexico wells that are in state waters. Those wells are more or less going to be governed fairly similar to onshore wells in terms of who retains liability for decommissioning, in terms of what agencies ultimately are in charge of plugging and monitoring orphan and abandoned wells. There's some differences, probably not interesting enough to go into here. But this, again, sort of wells that are taking place in federal waters. So obviously the most unique, interesting piece of wells that are in federal waters is that for decades now, it has been sort of the policy regulations within the Department of Interior. These wells retain joint and several liability. So operators accrue decommissioning liabilities for the time that they operate the lease. And those liabilities are not discharged completely when there is a lease transfer or when there is an asset sale. So even after they've sold the wells, gotten them off their books formally, they retain liability for any decommissioning obligations accrued during the time that they operated the lease. And that's sort of indefinitely until that lease is ultimately plugged, decommissioned, and set off into the sunset. It's obviously a drastic improvement over what we see in most states where operators are sort of able to walk away from wells altogether. But it's also not sort of without some challenges. And in the case studies that I'll be talking about today, you can see how joint and several liability plays out both in bankruptcy court, especially in contentious bankruptcy court, and how companies in that process have to reckon with these issues. And in the second case study I'll talk about today, we're also seeing instances where operators are actually attempting to challenge joint and several liabilities. So even though it has been, sort of enshrined as a hallmark of OCS leasing for, as far back as the 50s, companies are looking for creative ways to make the claim that they actually are no longer on the hook for wells that they have sold. And I think the one thing that this raises many questions, but I think one interesting one, especially for investors and then also for regulators, is that what joint and several liability effectively means is that a lot of the major oil companies, folks who have a lot of legacy assets, are potentially carrying around very sizable off-balance sheet liabilities. So we're seeing a lot of asset divestitures across the country, especially from the oil majors, both on and offshore, because even in a high oil price environment, oftentimes removing the liability of these wells off their balance sheet is worth more than any future cash flows they're going to get from these wells. So they're selling the wells, they're divesting them. But of course, the sort of problem remains, which is even though they're not formally counted as AROs or anything else on a balance sheet, they are indefinitely on the hook for decommissioning obligations along the way. As far as I know, they're not breaking any laws, breaking any accounting rules by not, disclosing these risks, because I do think they are quite complicated to quantify. Like, how do you know if a company you sold a well to in the 90s is going to remain solvent? But I think it creates a big question about how operators should be disclosing risks in a scenario where they're divesting significant amounts of their offshore properties. There's also potentially a sort of off-balance sheet risk for federal regulators as well. So, federal regulators, we'll see this in the Fieldwood case study I'm going to talk about shortly. They have remained pretty confident with a lot of these offshore properties that, in many cases, there is going to be a private operator who is solvent at the end of the day, who can pay for decommissioning, even if existing operators can't foot the bill anymore. And I think, again, probably a pretty fair assumption right now, especially when oil companies are, throwing off cash like it's Standard Oil days. But, we don't know what the future is going to hold. We don't know to the extent to which oil companies will become creative in challenging some of these decommissioning liabilities. So, I think it sort of remains a big question about how and is the federal government, is DOI adequately protecting taxpayers and ensuring that, they're getting the financial insurances they need right now, or the regulatory changes they need right now to make sure that operators aren't going to be able to walk away from these wells down the line. So it's a bit of context setting. But yeah, I want to walk through basically two case studies that I think are sort of representative of the dynamic that's happening in offshore wells, especially when it comes to decommissioning. So the first one, if I can get my slide to work, is Fieldwood Energy's Chapter 11 case. So some folks may be familiar with Fieldwood Energy. This was sort of one of the, blockbuster oil and gas bankruptcies of 2020. It was actually Fieldwood Energy's second Chapter 11 filing in a number of years. But the basic backstory here is that Fieldwood Energy's business model was to purchase sort of end-of-life, shallow Gulf of Mexico oil wells from larger operators like APA, Exxon, etc. And then to basically squeeze whatever, dollars they could get out of them, and then put that money into decommissioning the wells along the way. It turns out that model was not terribly successful, especially following an oil price collapse in 2020. So Fieldwood Energy found itself in court. And it was a pretty long and pretty contentious Chapter 11 case. And the focal point, the focal piece of contention for the entire case was what was going to happen when it comes to decommissioning these wells. Which companies were going to be on the hook for them, and how was Fieldwood going to be restructured to basically optimize decommissioning and to minimize the number of wells that were ultimately abandoned. So sort of the big dispute. You can see here in this probably now unreadable slide, but this is basically how Fieldwood was ultimately sort of sliced and diced in order to create a plan for decommissioning the wells. And I'll just talk about a couple of slices because I think, again, all of these, I don't believe are terribly unique to Fieldwood, and I think speak to, what will happen in future bankruptcies and future insolvencies for Gulf of Mexico operators. So about 2/3 of Fieldwood's wells were previously owned by Apache, now APA. So they struck a deal with Fieldwood in advance of bankruptcy. So they had a sort of pre-written deal before filing for Chapter 11 because, 2/3 of the wells, they sort of had no choice. So through that deal, they created a separate company. At the time, it was called Fieldwood One, and they put all of the Apache wells into that bucket. Had a sort of somewhat sizable cash infusion, both from the parent company. They had some money in there from a trust that Apache had previously established for well decommissioning, knowing that it had this joint and several liability even after it sold the wells to Fieldwood. They took a chunk of money from surety companies who had insured those wells. But then the main sort of piece of the puzzle here was that the plan for decommissioning these wells is that they would be basically put into a trust of sorts, and they would take every penny from the operation cash flow of these wells and put it into a fund to decommission. And this was going to how they were going to wind down this whole bucket of Fieldwood assets. Of course, it ended up being a bit more complicated than it actually played out in bankruptcy. And this was actually some great reporting that Steve and Daniel did at Capital Forum, which is that Apache pretty radically underestimated how much money they were going to have to pull into Fieldwood One in order to decommission these properties. Because all of the models that they were using in terms of decline curves, in terms of production numbers for how they were going to get cash from the existing well to pay for decommission, my 6-year-old probably could have scribbled some numbers on the wall, and it may have been closer to their actual estimates, maybe overstating the case a bit. But Daniel and Steve's work found that Apache had actually underestimated what they were going to have to pour into this company by as much as $500 million, because that's how much it was going to cost to ultimately clean up these wells. So we have a situation with Apache where, they sold these wells, and now in the back end of bankruptcy, they are paying out a trust they had to establish because of joint and several liability. They're pissed off a lot of their surety bonding companies because that money's being poured into it. And then they're actually having to do a pretty sizable cash infusion on top of that to decommission the wells, because there's just not enough oil available that they could sell at a good price to cover it up. So that was sort of Apache's piece of the puzzle. There were a couple of other companies that sort of were really engaged in the bankruptcy. So Exxon in particular, BP has as well, aggressively challenged the plan. In their view, Fieldwood shouldn't have been allowed to restructure under Chapter 11. In their view, they basically should have had a Chapter 7 liquidation with every cent poured into decommissioning, because they knew, again, if the reorganized Fieldwood failed and they were still on the hook for some of those legacy assets, that was going to be hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars coming back to them to clean up these wells. Surety bond companies hated this. Some of them have even threatened to stop Gulf of Mexico bonding as a result of this procedure, because they were being called up to pour a ton of cash into the process. And then I think, sort of relevant to this discussion ultimately about the sort of role of regulators and the role of policy in all of this, Department of Interior, even though there were going to be a pretty sizable number of wells potentially abandoned by this plan, did not challenge the bankruptcy plan. Again, because in their assumption, even if the reorganized Fieldwood failed, even if these cash infusions were not enough to keep these companies solvent, even if these plans to use existing wells to decommission were not viable, they knew that at the end of the day, it was APA, Exxon, Chevron, BP who had accrued the decommissioning liabilities in the early years of these wells. And to whatever extent they remain solvent, that was a shield between, taxpayers basically and these bills. So, Fieldwood was a sort of interesting case for lots of reasons. I spent too much of my life probably thinking about it and talking about it, but I think it shows how these liabilities can come back, and also the types of assumptions that the Department of Interior and others are making about the extent to which this joint and several liability is going to be a shield for taxpayers to not have to clean up these wells. So let me talk about, to that point, my next sort of case study here. So these are basically two cases where companies have actually attempted recently to challenge joint and several liability. Again, in the Fieldwood case, really none of those operators were trying to make the case that they no longer had decommissioning obligations. They were just angry at the court and angry at Fieldwood that they had run such a sloppy operation that now those charges were coming back to bite them on the back end. These are issues where companies are actually trying to make the claim that they no longer have accrued decommissioning liability. So the Anadarko case was in 2014. Anadarko was ordered by the Department of Interior to decommission some Gulf of Mexico wells they'd sold to a smaller operator. And they challenged that order, both basically internally within Department of Interior, claiming that at the time they sold the wells in 1984, the existing regulations did not impose what they called residual contingent decommissioning obligations. In their view, they felt that the law at the time of the sale was somewhat unclear, and that they, in good faith believed that they were free and clear of all liabilities at the time of the asset sale. Department of Interior's own appeals board came back and said, no, that's not how any of this works. And Anadarko was ultimately able to decommission. And you would think that would send a pretty strong precedent, but just this year we're seeing that same argument return to these appeals boards within Department of Interior. So there was an offshore California operator named Signal Hill that recently had to relinquish its lease back to the Department of Interior due to the spat it had with the state of California. Department of Interior went back to the prior owner. In this case, it was Occidental, ConocoPhillips, and Devon, telling them it was now their turn to have to clean up these and decommission these wells. And they have kind of in a package now gone and appealed this case before Department of Interior, arguing very similar things, that they have no accrued obligations for decommissioning, and that they believe, or they're trying to make the case, that at the time of this asset sale that happened around the late 80s, early 90s, that MMS interpretation of the law at the time was that liability did not extend to operators once they had sold their lease. And there's an image here on the screen. They've dug up some very, I don't know what file cabinet in what office they were keeping these documents, but they've been pulling out some really interesting memos from MMS at the time. And, they had this argument basically pretty locked and loaded that for these asset sales that happened in the 80s and 90s, they no longer have obligations to decommission. And so, I think it'll be interesting, to see how this Signal Hill case proceeds. My sense is it's going to be pretty similar to Anadarko, and Interior is going to come back and order them to decommission the well. But I'm always kind of looking for places where operators are trying to test the waters a little bit. And, even if this, prevails and these operators are, forced to follow the law, it does sort of indicate, how they can also kind of gum up the works at Department of Interior, because these decommissioning orders were sent out in 2020 and the case is still pending. And, in the meantime, these wells, these platforms are sitting, with a very minimal monitoring budget, making sure there's not a disaster. But, they can really gum up the works and delay this process and make it quite difficult for DOI to actually enforce the law. And that can be, something to keep an eye on, and something regulators need to be aware of, so that they're prepared to challenge these kinds of attacks. Now I'm going to take a big detour and just talk really briefly about the Interstate Oil and Gas Compact Commission. So again, really important body, basically. So effectively, they're kind of, at least on the surface, they're effectively sort of a trade group for oil and gas regulators. So they're a body that convenes oil and gas regulators from, dozen plus states. They pass resolutions, and then they work really closely with federal agencies, especially when there are projects that have to be implemented across a number of states, funds that have to be dispersed across a number of states, policy questions where you have to figure out how it's going to be applied in a number of states. So they play a pretty important role. A couple things I'll say is just one, they have often acted throughout history very much as a stealth lobby group. So they get direct funding from industry. Industry is often able to kind of wine and dine regulators in the context of Interstate Oil and Gas Compact Commission meetings. So they, even though they're sort of effectively a group of regulators, they can function as a really powerful lobby force. Probably the bit of lobbying that they're most well known for is that, the IOGCC was really instrumental rather in getting the Halliburton loophole into place with clean water, oil and gas. But yeah, these two notes on the screen, I just want to share really quick, because they're from a Texas regulator, Wayne Christian, who's the former vice chair of the IOGCC. And the IOGCC plays a really important role in the Infrastructure and Jobs Act, in that they have a formally enshrined role they're paid to do to help the federal government figure out how to disperse dollars to states for abandoned well cleanup. You have to be an IOGCC member to get money from this program, and the IOGCC negotiates and guides DOI in determining how formula funds are applied, or in terms of how other states sort of access money through this program. And what's really interesting is that we've seen from folks like Wayne Christian and other IOGCC members that they really see their role in this process as making sure that this is as direct of a subsidy to industry as possible, and that states are not required to make any significant regulatory change as a result of accessing federal money. So there was a lot of call when this law was being passed to make these federal dollars contingent on some amount of bonding reform or other regulatory reform that reduced the number of orphan wells moving forward. And IOGC was a really big player in negotiating with Department of Interior and kind of using the collective power of those state regulators to ensure that the money effectively came down with no strings attached. Now, from my perspective, like, money for orphan wells is a good thing, even if it doesn't come with strings attached, but sort of a missed opportunity to make a dent in the future scale of this problem, with the IGCC and others really playing a significant role in making sure that didn't happen. So Daniel, maybe I'll stop there. Yeah, obviously if you have questions or whatever after Ted's talk as well.
You mentioned that the sureties that wanted to pull out of the Gulf, obviously that was during a low commodity price environment. That's why we saw Fieldwood bankrupt, CRC bankrupt, and right now it's going to be a little bit different. We're going to have a little bit more business, but that doesn't mean there's not going to be a downturn again. The industry themselves foresee it. So, I mean, what were can you just extrapolate a little bit more on what you saw with those sureties, what it looked like, and the implications there of what it would be, I don't know, an operator in the Gulf where it's in terminal decline and you don't have someone to be able to post that cash?
Yeah, that's a great question. So basically, it turns out the sureties did not pull out of the Gulf despite their claims. But I do think, Daniel, to your point, a lot of that is it is a high price environment, right? So I think even the Haynes and Boone and others who have done bankruptcy tracking have kind of paused on that for the oil, because we're not going to see probably a big surge of bankruptcies anytime soon. But I think to their point is that they basically felt that, like, they should not ultimately be on the hook for paying to decommission these wells, especially if Fieldwood was going to be continuing as like a viable company. That they thought, I think somewhat similar to a lot of the predecessors, they felt that, if it'd be a different story if this was just a liquidation and the company was completely insolvent, and then you were turning to insurers and you were returning to predecessors to pick up the tab. But in the event that Fieldwood is going to potentially move forward as, a debt-free, more viable, certainly in this price environment, more viable company, that it wouldn't be appropriate for the insurance companies to have to pay to decommission these wells. And then I think to the second part, the question about terminal decline is, I think, a really big one, and that really bore out with the Apache wells, Daniel, that I know you've done some really good reporting on. But I think, to whatever extent these companies are making the assumption that they're going to be able to cover decommissioning costs through just the cash they're generating from wells, I don't think that's going to turn out to be true in many cases. And then yes, if you don't have an insurer backstopping you, and if you don't have a predecessor like Exxon that can also backstop that well, then those wells will ultimately be decommissioned and cleaned up by taxpayers, and that's a pretty sizable risk we could see moving forward.
All right, great, awesome. Thanks for having me here, Daniel. It's nice to be in person. Glad to be in DC with everybody. So what I'd like to do just in the next 15, 20 minutes, I think, somewhere around there, is just sort of explore the initial funding that we were talking about, the federal orphan well funding included in bill, and just sort of talk about what the plan is in some of the states. I'm going to look at 4 of them, and what some of the big takeaways are, and also some next things that we'll be looking at, and also take a little spotlight on one company that Daniel mentioned exactly. So everybody knows, so there's about $4.7 billion in that federal orphan well funding, the methane reduction fund. And there's basically, for states, there's 4.3. billion. And those are in 3 tranches of money, or buckets as we talk about. One of them is the initial grants, where most of the states, 24, got $25 million apiece. And like Kelly said, they got to be a member of the IOGCC. And then moving forward, there's something called a formula grant that Kelly talked about too, about how that's going to happen and how that's going to be dispersed. That's the biggest source of money. And then lastly, there's performance-based grants. And those are based on regulations you change. There's 2 things that you can do. And then there's also matching funds. It looks at how much you spend over the prior 10 years and the gap between what you're spending those prior 10 years and today. And the federal government might give you some money or a grant up to, I think, about $30 million to fill that. But those guidances have not come out. The one that has come out is initial grants. And so back in August, the Department of Interior announced that these $560 million is out the door to 24 states finally, almost a year after this bill passed. And that states plan to plug about 10,000 wells. One thing you want to keep note too, there's about 215 million left over. So there's 775 that are appropriated, the only 215. Not as many states are grabbing the money as you thought was going to happen. So that's one takeaway, early takeaway from all that. So, and I think there's one iron law in DC too. I think when policy happens, especially around the extractive industry, that money's got to flow upward. And it's got to go in the right direction. Otherwise, can't build big public programs anymore, and that's part of the problem, which is a whole other topic. But it really helps ensure that people don't support the public good when that happens. And we're going to look at a couple states to understand that broader topic too. So in West Virginia, where I live in Charleston, West Virginia, they told the Department of Interior that they had the highest plugging cost, I think, of any other state, over $150,000. And they estimated recently that it's going to cost about $125,000 to plug each well. And when this influx of money come in, there's a choice to be made. Okay, are we going to hire up staff, get some engineers, get some environmental consultants on staff and push this money out? Or what are we going to do? Well, West Virginia said, fire hose, water tastes good, lot coming out, and we're just going to we're going to send it out. And this also helps us not be responsible too in the instance. So what they decided to do is have 6 jumbo packages of 160 wells that total about $20 million. And contractors are allowed to pick which of these documented or undocumented. Like Natalie said, if they happen to find they can plug that too. The only catch is about 25% have to be a Class A well, which is a well usually that's hazardous, leaking methane, or other VOCs in the area, or it's a problematic well. It could be like at a school or near a church or something like that. But for the most part, free range. They get to design the whole well package themselves. Usually this is done in-house. Usually the Department of Environmental Protection in West Virginia puts out a huge list. Here's the well you're plugging. Here's where it is. Here's all the aspects to it. Here are the exact procedures you need to follow when you do that. So West Virginia's not doing that. They're saying, here, the money, you hire your own your well design services. And also, as a catch, because we don't have enough staff at the West Virginia DEP, you hire your own people, your compliance officers, to make sure you're doing a good job. They can sign an affidavit saying you plugged the well and you did it right. We don't need to go out and see that. Maybe we do. That's a good catch, because they might actually be doing that. And I think it's going to come back to one of the conclusions too. But overall, they awarded about $20 million in August to P&A, about 160 wells at $123,000 a well. That's a lot. That's higher than a lot of the estimates that we see all the time. We'll get into that too. Secondly, Ohio is another state that said, a lot of money coming in and we don't want to hire anybody. A lot of times this is political will, but it's also privatization. And on the heels of this was a report that the Ohio Auditors Division did. And one of the recommendations in that report is, 2 of them were very fascinating. One was like, if you got too much money, you better outsource all of the in-house work, because you guys can't handle it. You're mandated to spend this much money, which they are, but they could have said, maybe you need to hire more staff internally to make sure the job's done. And the one thing I've found in my life is that industry doesn't want to see more inspectors, a lot more staff within these DEP, these regulatory bodies, because that means more people are looking at what they're doing. And I think that's part of the issue here. So what's easier, and what Ohio did was even different than West Virginia. They decided to have 2 construction managers at risk that will that they'll hire and they'll oversee the entire thing. And then they'll have design services. So your environmental engineering firms will design the well funding packages. And then these construction managers at risk will put out bids. They can even bid on it themselves, as we'll talk about a little later, and then they can get it. And that's really taking all your in-house services and pushing them out. And that's what they decided to do. Talk to their offices about that. They decided to give it a try. But that's what that audit said to do too. They said you need to get that money out. And what that audit said too is you guys are inspecting too many wells. It's a little redundant. Why not just get a verification that the well's been inspected? It's not usually a best practice. I've never heard of any type of audit saying you're inspecting too many wells. That blew my mind. But Ohio has one of the bigger well funding, orphan well programs in the whole country, probably second to Texas, I think. But anyway, so West Virginia and Ohio are both sort of looking at pushing that money out through different ways. So they're not scaling up or hiring additional staff. Now, 2 other states, Kentucky and Pennsylvania, that I looked at. So these 4 states, West Virginia, Ohio, Kentucky, Pennsylvania, represent about 1/4 of that total $4.3 billion. That's my estimate, probably around there. So it's a significant portion. And Kentucky has very shallow wells, and they plan to plug, they said, about 1,000 to 1,200 with this initial $25 million. And they're estimating, they estimated earlier on that it costs about $20,000 to plug a well in Kentucky. Think 20,000, 125, huge difference, but they are shallower. They do have a lot of horizontal wells, but they're older horizontal, they're not high volume fracking wells. They don't have that in Kentucky. But they have just, so far, they've awarded 20 contracts for 360 wells for about $11.5 million. And one thing that came back very interestingly is on that first tranche of funds, so about half of that $25 million from that initial grant, the average cost per well is about $32,000. So Kentucky estimated 20. If you go back to the IOGCC report, they're estimating less than $5,000 to plug a well. So what's happening? The federal government pays for it. Now it costs more to plug. Or is there more oversight? We'll talk about that in a little bit, hopefully. But Kentucky's planning on hiring about 15 to 20 people when they put these packages out. They gave a whole huge litany of the design of where the wells are, where to plug them. They did it by county and region, like most places, which was smart. But they are providing that service in Kentucky. When I looked at all of these 360 wells, the average depth was 1,100 feet. So that's a very shallow well. Fracking well in Appalachia is about 5,500 feet in that range, but even in Western, the older conventional wells in Eastern Kentucky, West Virginia tend to be closer to 3,000 feet. So Pennsylvania is the next state, and Pennsylvania has gone through some troubles. Another thing when you say, hey, states, do this, instead of the federal government, states can get naughty and do different things. And Pennsylvania's legislature decided to do that, and they decided to say, whoa, you're getting all this money from the federal government, let's take that money. We want to divert that money and not have a bidding process for that money, but just give it out in grants. And if you've ever plugged a well, or if you know anybody that has access to well plugging machinery and equipment, we want to be able to give this money out in grants. And right now the bill says, I believe 40 and 70,000. So if it's over 3,000 feet, you get 70,000. They decided to take 20%. I think this bill's passed. I think it was passed last week, but 20% of Pennsylvania's total, which I think they're going to get about $400 million, so it's about $80 million that will go to this grant fund, which is kind of remarkable. Like, is that good government to not have a bidding process and an RFP process, just to give it out like candy? I said we should start a company, because I know plugging companies. I'll just say they'll plug it, and I'm Bettner Incorporated. So we'll see. Maybe I'll get into the plugging business myself, like my friends at Diversified. That is what's happening there. So they have their first bid packages out in September of about 249 wells in September and October. They've been very slow because of that diversion I've been talking about. They're going to have to put 20% into this new program. They had to go fix that bill too, but I'll save that conversation for later. Like Kentucky, Pennsylvania is also hiring additional staff. I think anywhere from 20 to 40. And Pennsylvania has a pretty more in-depth field staff than most of the other states. And you'll notice that if you look at their notices of violation, when you go online and look at notices of violation by state, Suddenly Pennsylvania has like 10 times. It's obvious like there's a lot more people out in the field there looking at wells, and you know, when you look at stuff, you have more notices of violation. So just some big takeaways, looking at these 4 states, about a fourth of the program, $100 million that they're putting out, is that the staffing or the lack of political will is causing some of these state orphan well programs to privatize their traditional duties of designing well plugging packages, inspection, and prioritization. We give that up and say, hey, we're not even focused on the worst wells. You guys figure that out. You know, so that's you know, but it is tempting for agencies to, when they get a large burst of funds, like my initial reaction sometimes too, when somebody puts a lot of responsibility on me, where can I delegate that responsibility? So it is understandable that, you know, when you have this money and it needs to be spent in 1 year, what am I going to do? Well, the easiest thing to do is to say, boom, let's contract. And that's what they do. But I think it's imperative that, you know, policymakers that appropriate this necessary funding, you know, make sure that the foxes are not guarding the henhouse, which can happen here. So, but I do think one of the main reasons that we're seeing those P&A costs high, one reason, I mean, I think also labor and material costs are at a premium right now with a lot of the macroeconomic things that are happening. But also it's just like the federal government's paying, and they're going to have to report who witnessed the well being plugged. You know, it's hard to tell exactly, because the DOI has to report this to Congress, I believe, next year about what's happening. So that verification is true. And one of the big things that I think is happening too is that companies are way more likely to follow P&A methods and procedures that's different. Every state has different plugging regulations. They tell you how to plug a well, and each well can be very different. But my guess is they're following that T of doing that more correctly when it's a contract with the state, because you better do that because you're bonded, follows all these different things. You know, so those are some of the big takeaways. And probably from just like a one company perspective, one of the biggest takeaways is that all this money that I've been talking about, you know, close to about 25 million is the largest well owner in the United States has purchased over the last year, I believe, purchased 3 P&A companies, so gas service plugging companies. And one of them is Next LVL Energy, which is located in Jane Lew, West Virginia, and also Pittsburgh, West Virginia. And they were awarded 3 of the 6 well packages in West Virginia, the majority of the wells. They're going to plug 100 wells in West Virginia. So the irony there is a little rich, because when we looked at their first half 2022 financial report that came out, Diversified says they can plug wells for for about $20,000 per well. But when they're bidding on orphan wells, which generally speaking are a little more costly to plug, I don't think anybody thinks they're 6 times as much to plug. You know, we're going from $20,000 to $126,000. I don't think anybody thinks that. And we're talking about wells, generally speaking, you know, in the same range, 3,000 feet. One of the things that we were able to do was, you know, use the capital reform upstream data, was to be able to look at the wells that Diversified owns that they've plugged over the last couple of years. And they tend to be, you know, over 3,000 feet and around the 40-year mark. If we look at the roughly 200 wells that were plugged in the last couple of years that Diversified owns, that's where we are. And there's, you know, and then let's go back to Kentucky, where wells are shallow. You know, the average was 1,100 feet we were just talking about. We looked at one well package there in Cumberland County and found that the average depth was about a little over 1,000 feet, and the average age was about 1991 compared to about 1999 in the Diversified well set. And one was those were $32,000, and those were 1,100 feet. And the Diversifieds were well over 2,000 feet, and they were 20 grand. And I think it comes back to the National Petroleum Council a couple years ago had a report where they asked people about P&A practices, and they said, well, you know, it's a cost. Nobody likes to do it, and you do it the cheapest possible because it's an afterthought, which I thought was just like, wow, I love when people are very blatantly honest. So I think that is one of the issues we're running at. And I think just in closing, when we look at this, there's just significant deficiencies in well plugging methods and practices, and there's little consensus on technical guidance on what constitutes best or most attractive most best practices for P&A. We were talking about like this well's plugged, this is not. Define plugged. What does plugged mean? What's a bare minimum? What's the bologna sandwich of plugged? Like, I don't know. Is it plugged in 1920? Is that plugged with this? I mean, like, what's plugged? Have to have cement in it? Two plug? I mean, what is it? I think API did come out with some guidance last year on some best practices, but I think that development of that, when you're talking about selling carbon credits, for instance, like, what's plugged? It's like you're going to run into these issues. So I think that is like the next frontier is this first order question of what constitutes, how long does a well plug last? 10 years, 20, 30, 50, 100? I've seen people say all those numbers, then you look for the footnotes, not there, because we don't really know. So I think the next form of, or little Manhattan Project in this industry is going to be able to figure that out, because that has ramifications on companies' balance sheet, how much those AROs cost, they're looking at, and everything. So, but just leave it there if you have any questions.
Perfect, Ted. Yeah, I have a few things. And that cash spend, too, the more that they retire, it's a balance sheet issue, but it's going to be a cash issue if they need to actually get this stuff out the door. And I think Natalie's this morning speaks a little bit to the Manhattan Project aspect of this, but shows, like I've been saying, how nascent it is. It's like we don't even know how to measure the methane. We don't even know how to determine the casing. So a few things that I wanted to highlight, and just so you guys know, Ted and I talk almost every single day, which I love. And he's highlighted, for instance, that language in the National Petroleum Council document to me a number of times. And it's attention to detail like that I think will help our government and help the market adapt. So we're very clearly putting the cart before the horse. We're dispersing funds at a rate that states can't take it. We're implementing programs that don't have the technological capability to understand the underlying assets. And you have interesting anomalies. So without even doing, so can we just kind of review, because it's so on its head. I saw like our attendees kind of squint their eyes. Did we understand this right, that Diversified Energy, which has the largest inventory of inactive wells, is getting bids from the states?
Yes, just to be very clear, the total is a little over $12 million in West Virginia, $12.6 million for 3 contracts in West Virginia, and they're getting $12.5 million. This is Next LVL Energy, $12.5 million as one of the contractors at risk in Ohio. So they're getting, roughly in the neighborhood of close to $25 million. And there's also all this money in IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, $1.5 billion. Back to that rule you were talking about. Well, there's all this money in there to, plug marginal wells. Well, what company owns the most marginal wells in the United States?
Diversified.
Yeah. So I mean, it's very smart on their way. But the fact is, these are a declining asset, and they might be producing cash today, but nobody believes that a company's going to stick around for the last 30 or 40 years of its life and plug wells.
And the discrepancy between the cost that they're bidding from states, between the cost that they forecast for their own wells, is what?
So their latest forecast was a little over I think it was $20,050. That's what they said it cost to plug, I think around 90 wells the first half of 2022, okay? And then when they actually bid, so we know that they bid on 100 wells in West Virginia, it's $126,000 per well. So I know orphan wells can be older, they can have much issues, I don't doubt that at all, but their own well sets, and we've looked at those, are older too. And the wells that they have been plugging are fairly old. We don't know exactly what wells are going to be plugging in West Virginia, because West Virginia didn't say you had to plug this one. They get to choose.
Crazy.
Yeah, so if they're choosing, would you not choose ones that are the easiest? I mean, outside of that 25%. So it just shows you when the magnifying glass might be on you a little bit more, even though you can hire your own compliance officers and sign off on it. There's something at play here, and I don't think economies of scale can happen, because we're seeing all these other bids in Kentucky, right? There's a company there that's plugging 25 wells in Kentucky this year, right? That's Diversified doesn't plug that many in Kentucky in a year, right? So if they're saying it's 32,000 for a well that's 1,100 feet, there's something amiss here.
Yes, there's objectively a discrepancy.
Yes, so 6 times as much.
Is there a risk either, I mean, I imagine in their bid document, they're going to have information about the cost of the well. And then SEC filing saying the cost of the well, one of those is gonna be a fraudulent number. I mean, one of them's fraudulent. Is there any kind of risk that Diversified is gonna get caught lying about what they're saying the cost? I mean, if it's 6 times,
I mean, I in my short tenure in this work, I have never seen somebody go around and audit plugged wells. Like, hey, I'm gonna go and look at all these wells you've just plugged in West Virginia. I'm gonna go independently verify that you didn't just pour cement there and clean up around it. Now, if they're in state parks and stuff, they will do that. They'll do a much better job, I think. But that's the thing, like, you just don't know. I mean, they could just say, well, we plugged it and signed off on it. I mean, like, sometimes people go out and check them out. But I think, I would already say that's an open case. But I think the discrepancy between the numbers is so great that it's very difficult to reconcile those two.
Yeah.
Question on the per wells, like the variation of the prices as well, because my understanding of federal funds is when you contract it out, you have to establish price reasonableness. So is it that it's flowing through the state that no longer applies, or do they say that it's reasonable to have $100,000 swag?
I mean, as far as I know, each state has their own P&A standards that they usually have, and they can determine and estimate what the cost is. And what the state of West Virginia just did, since they looked and said, hey, last couple of years, actually, to be honest with you, they only plugged like 3 or 4 wells last couple of years. And they said they were all I saw them, they were all well over $100,000. Some of them were close to 200. And they said, this is what we think it's gonna cost. And I was at the contract when they were, the pre-bid meeting for that. That's what he said. He said, we estimate these wells are gonna cost about $126,000. I mean, the question I have in the back of my head is like, how come a company could come in there and be like, well, we'll bid 80? Maybe we can, I don't know, but I just know that these wells are expensive, especially in West Virginia. It can cost as much, the reclamation side can cost more than the plugging, because sometimes you have to build a road just to get out there and get a rig out there. I mean, that can take a long time. One thing that's very not talked about in a lot of the documents from Diversified is reclamation. We know they're plugging the well. Well, if reclamation sometimes is twice the cost of plugging, where's that cost? What does that look like?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, and the very first story we ever wrote about Diversified in 2019, we found a discrepancy between their security filings and their realized plugging costs. Where they forecast $23,500 per well, and we found a $130,000 one just by crunching the numbers and giving it a good shake. Here, what they'll say is there's different characteristics in this bidding package, and to your point, Stephanie, the reason why the states have that much variance is, as Ted highlights, is there's not good data out there, and so the initial DOI. I mean, Julia and I told Tennessee DEC when the filing date was for this grant. So the DOI rolled this stuff out very quickly, and the initial grant funding was supposed to be kind of foundational, and then they just were like, let's just get it moving, and then we're going to do this performance grant stuff, and then we've been observing month on month, very to my dismay at least, this it's growing more and more toothless. It's like that. It's a classic kind of one of those. I think I'm using the term right, pork barrel. And
one of the worst things is they define what an orphan well is for federal land. They didn't for state. So state could say, this is all what an orphan well is. And we noticed, I mean, and Daniel definitely has in several reports of how many orphan wells are owned by companies we all know, like Standard Oil, or I can go, the list goes on and on, that why is this listed as no operator when we know who the operator was? This is odd.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the problem, is you can't do that. The states created this entire mess. And I honestly think the only way to bring it up and clean it up is to have some type of fee assessed on there and some type of long-term program that has a a trust fund, sort of like the AML, being in Mineland, but not like that, but not like that. That would deal with this, because you have to deal with this forever. It's never done. It's never one and done. We plugged and we never have to look at that well again. It's over. Problem is, this is a monitoring process forever, and someone needs to be responsible for it.
Does the contractor who plugs the well have any liability?
1 year. I asked that same question. I said, when they plug that well, how long is that contractor reliable? I think mostly it's one. They're bonded. It's 1 year. That's funny you asked that, because I asked that same question. Because then it's the states. I mean, it is the states. It's and back to the question, why don't they look up these undocumented wells? Why don't they add any more to the list? If you're a state, why would you want to add more orphan wells to your list? That's everything is 100. West Virginia, each of those are $100,000. Why would I want to accept that liability? I mean, I think that's been always the hesitancy of trying to add them.
Yeah,
They
absolutely.
don't care about poisoning their people, I suppose.
That's way down on the list. Sorry. Just
Yeah.
kidding.
Ted, a pleasure as always. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it.